All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 3 o'clock session. This is about redistricting and 10 things that GIS people should know about redistricting for 2021. We have with us this afternoon Blake Esselstyn. Blake is a GISP and he's a principal for a firm called Map Figure Consulting. He has over 25 years of experience in a wide range of contexts, most currently in redistricting. He's presented on the topic at UNC Chapel Hill, at Duke University, at UNC Asheville, and Harvard, among others. So we're pleased to have him today to talk to us about this topic. I'll be managing the chat and we'll take your questions at the end of Blake's presentation. Blake?
Thank you, Tim. And I wanted to start by saying thank you to all the organizers and thank you to the audience for showing up. I'll be talking about changes to the redistricting landscape in recent years, and I would argue that whether you're going to be directly involved with redistricting or not, these are important to know about. And there's a lot to cover. We could spend easily an hour talking about each of these 10 items, but I've got about 2 or 3 minutes for each. So it'll be high level and I'll be talking fast, but there will be some URLs throughout the presentation that you can refer to. I'll be sharing the slides. And also, if you look at my Twitter feed, I cover almost exclusively stuff like this. And lastly, before I jump in, I do want to say that most of my examples come from North Carolina, but almost all this stuff will apply nationally. And the 10 items are not in order of any kind of importance, but I tried to put them in an order with sort of a logical sequence and flow. And if you look at the blurb in the program, you'll see that these are the main themes. Math was not mentioned in there, but that's a significant one that we'll be covering as well. And a lot of the first ones start with the census theme. And this actually, the census data delivery timing and the changes to that, and actually it's sort of breaking news. These have been covered in the news in the past week and 10 days. There was a big announcement last Friday because this is an older slide. Initially, in a typical year, what the Census Bureau had been predicting was that the redistricting data here would be delivered on a rolling basis between this date, which you might recognize, it's actually today's date, through the end of March. But they, because of COVID, things got delayed and other complications. So now they announced last week that the delivery day is going to be September 30th. And I think it's helpful to look at this visually through a timeline. So we're looking basically at the year 2021 from February through December. We've got today there. And typically, as I said, the census data delivery would be happening here. And then filing for odd year elections. So in a lot of municipalities, some school boards have their filing period in late July because they have odd year elections in November. And they might have a runoff in between. After the primary, I should say. So before filing can begin, the Board of Elections needs a month or so to do what they need to do in order to process the redistricting plans. So the period of time for redistricting is about 3 months for the local governments like cities and school boards that have odd year elections. But this year, the data, this green bar over here, is actually after this. So this all gets thrown out the window. And now the cities that have districted elections and odd year elections are trying to figure out what to do. And one contingency is to, and the statutes allow for this, will be that municipalities will move their elections to 2022, that they'll be postponed to 2022. And the 2022 filing period starts in early December. So again, you give the boards of elections a month to do what they need to do, and that only leaves 5 weeks. Which is a very, very constrained time period for local governments, some of whom only have meetings once a month to complete this process. So another contingency scenario would involve not only moving these elections to 2022, but actually changing the primary date. Folks may recall in North Carolina, we used to have our primaries in May, but for even year elections, they've now moved those to March. But if the primary was moved to May, then the filing wouldn't start until probably sometime in February, which is here. I should point out that this timeline has changed. This is starting with the new data delivery estimate for late September. And then working backward from there, boards of elections need a month, and that would allow more like 3 months for the local governments to do their redistricting. But it's important to notice that in late November and December here, we've got lots of holidays, New Year's, so folks in government as well as other workplaces know that it's tricky to get things done in that time of year. So it'll be interesting to see what unfolds. This is still very much a moving target. Moving from census timing to the census geographic data, this time around, the Tiger data will be more accurate. So folks may well be familiar with the standard hierarchy of census entities, and the central spine here is the most familiar one, with counties composed of census tracts, composed of block groups, composed of blocks. But for redistricting, the one that is more important is the one highlighted here, where you have counties composed of voting districts composed of census blocks. And these voting districts have all been redrawn in this geographic, or I shouldn't say they've all been redrawn, but they've been updated, and those were made available last month. So this is looking at Buncombe County, where I am based, and the purple lines are the current election precincts, and the green lines are the old VTDs, the previous VTDs. And you can see, for example, a precinct like this in an area where there's been population growth, they've had to split a precinct into two. You don't want to have a voting precinct with too many people. But the last VTDs did not align, but now switching to the current VTDs, you can see they align nicely. And if I didn't say so, VTD is a abbreviation for voting district. Moving back to the view showing the discrepancy, I'm going to zoom in on this area in the eastern part of the county. You can see that the precinct boundary and the old VTDs did not align as well, but now they align beautifully. Looking at another local example, this one is in Forsyth County, and thank you to NC1 Map for these lovely orthos. And I'm going to put in the existing congressional district boundary, and you can see that the congressional district boundary slices right through a house, and that's because it followed one of the older census block lines. This was a situation where the map drawers were splitting a precinct following census block lines and didn't realize it was splitting a house. And this is tricky for election officials because they have to determine which district the person in that house is based. And again, that house is sliced in half, and the way that the Board of Elections determines this is to find out where the person sleeps at night. And as Corinne Duncan, who folks may have seen present at NCGIS, she's the Director of Election Services in Buncombe County, points out, they have to find out where every voter in that house sleeps, and sometimes it can be awkward if voters aren't sleeping in the same part of the house. So just to show now what the new census block geometry looks like, you can see that the new blocks actually follow. This block had been intended to follow an administrative boundary that was aligned with the eastern part of this right-of-way, so it follows the fence line there nicely. Another quick example from Wake County. Again, you can see the building footprints and roads, and this is the existing congressional district boundary that slices through a bunch of homes. And again, that's because it followed one of these orange block boundaries that was drawn in more of a coarse fashion 10 years ago, but the newer version aligns well with the local GIS center lines here, and that's the green lines that following this road here and avoiding the building footprints. So the geographic data will be more accurate, but it's safe to say that the numeric data will actually be less accurate. And this isn't because of counting issues, this is because of an issue having to do with privacy. And the Census Bureau is implementing a new methodology for what it calls disclosure avoidance, also sometimes called differential privacy or formal privacy. And what this is this is an effort, the Census Bureau is bound by law to prevent private information about individuals or individual households from being divulged when they publish their block level data. But because of advances in computing power and processing power and mathematical techniques and machine learning and things like that, researchers have shown that the way that the granular fine-grained block level data was released in the past actually would allow folks with adequate processing power and the right tools to reverse engineer and extract individual data about individuals or individual households that the Census Bureau is supposed to be keeping private. So in order to prevent that, the Census Bureau is deliberately fudging the numbers, if you will. They're deliberately introducing inaccuracies, and they're doing it with this technique called differential privacy, and that allows for something of a sliding scale. This is a nice image from the census showing that you could either have perfect data quality and precision, but have essentially no privacy, or if you have perfect privacy, that would be very little precision. So they're trying to find the happy medium, and that is still to be determined. So there's still more to be found out between now and when the data is released in September, or when the data are released. Racial gerrymandering, big topic, especially in North Carolina. Folks are probably heard about this. One thing I'll quickly touch on is that there's something called Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act that has, there was a Supreme Court case called Shelby County versus Holder, which essentially got rid of that. That involved pre-clearance, and a number of counties in North Carolina had to pre-clear their plans with the US Department of Justice. That is no longer a requirement, but there is still Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is involved in some of the voting rights litigation and racial gerrymandering cases. So of more relevance to GIS folks is that in this past decade, a bunch of the state's most squiggly shaped election districts were found to be unconstitutional racial gerrymanders and overturned. This example is from Cumberland County and Hoke County. This was 4 state Senate districts. Folks may be familiar with the congressional districts, specifically District 1 and District 12 were overturned as racial gerrymanders, and because almost all the other districts bordered on these, the entire plan got redrawn with less squiggly districts. And here's a map showing essentially why District 12 was overturned, and I'll touch on how cases like this have changed the way that the redistricting will be handled. This district was drawn, the purple prisms here, the color, the shade of purple indicates the percentage of the Black population, and the height of the prisms indicates the population density of the Black population in those census tracts. And you can see that this district was drawn to bring in as many Black voters as possible. And the map drawers' justification was that they were arguing that they needed to create a district that would be safe, that would be reliably let Black voters elect their representative of choice. But what the courts have determined is that you do not need to have a majority Black district to do that. And in fact, the current District 12 is more like 40% Black voting age population, but still has been shown that it would reliably allow Black voters to have an opportunity to elect the candidate of their choosing. And that's consistent with the VRA. So in the past, people talked about majority minority districts, but that is no longer sort of the methodology. And it really varies from state to state and depends on the population and turnout and things like that. Partisan gerrymandering. This got more attention in North Carolina in recent years, and I would say nationally in recent years. Some of the key partisan gerrymandering cases were just in the last few years. And in 2019, Wake County Superior Court judges found that both General Assembly and congressional districts had been drawn with too much focus on partisan advantage. So here's an example from Mecklenburg County. This is the classic packing, one of the gerrymandering strategies. You can see these 3 districts, 38, 37, and 40, have almost all the darkest blue precincts in the entire county, whereas adjacent districts were drawn to be more competitive for red voters. And this was thrown out as, again, unconstitutional partisan gerrymandering. Here's another example of packing from the congressional districts. You can see that Congressional District 4 had almost entirely blue precincts, and they carved out the darkest blue precincts for the most part in Wake County, part of Durham County, and combined that with Chapel Hill to make this landslide district. So that sort of packing combined with cracking. Here's an example of cracking where Greensboro was split between 2 districts and then combined with a lot of areas that tended to vote for red candidates and also separated from Winston-Salem. And you may be saying, well, this isn't new. Why is this part of your summary of changes? The thing that's different is that for the first time, courts actually said that this was a violation of the North Carolina Constitution. These cases were not appealed to the Court of Appeals or the state Supreme Court, so there's not that level of precedent, but still it's significant that North Carolina courts, as well as Pennsylvania courts, determined that plans should be thrown out if they relied excessively on partisan information and partisan motivations. The those cases in North Carolina actually hinged on some new math that has to do significantly with geography. And very quickly, I'll do a quick review of the decade. So earlier in the decade, a lot of folks talking about gerrymandering focused a lot on the shapes. It was a lot of compactness. And you may notice this is North Carolina District 12 again, as the first one listed here when the Washington Post was talking about the most gerrymandered districts, focusing on their shapes. That's now not so much what mathematicians are doing. In 2017, folks may have heard about the efficiency gap. This got a fair amount of buzz. And this idea is based on looking at wasted votes for each party. So this example of wasted green and purple votes, and then you get a percentage. But this also didn't end up being significant in any cases where partisan gerrymandering plaintiffs prevailed. New York Times talked about it as well. So the hardcore mathematicians started looking at the math and coming up with more sophisticated analysis. And I could spend days talking about this. I actually went to a conference at Duke where people did exactly that. And so using things like graph theory, this is from a mathematician at Duke named Jonathan Mattingly, using something called Markov chain Monte Carlo processes to have computers generate thousands of compliant redistricting plans, that complied with keeping counties intact and population equality and compactness and things like that. And then comparing these thousands of plans to the plans that were being challenged in court and looking at them. And you can see, for example, right here, the 10th most Republican congressional district in his plans would be in the plans generated in a nonpartisan algorithmic way are represented by sort of these gray lines and the boxes and whiskers here. And the purple dot here was from the 2016 congressional plan, and it's a significant outlier. Some would say an extreme outlier. And I think the general theme of this math is, unlike the efficiency gap, these are taking into account the geography and where the voters are located. So very quickly, this is one of my favorites from a mathematician named Moon Duchin at Tufts, comparing Maryland and Massachusetts. You can see they both have about a third of voters who vote Republican, but in Maryland, you can actually draw multiple districts that would be safe for Republicans. In Massachusetts, almost all the areas that the voters are basically spread evenly or distributed in similar ways throughout the state. So it's not possible to draw a district that would reliably vote for the Republican candidate. So these forms of analysis really focus on the geography, which is something I think GIS folks will appreciate. Speaking of GIS folks appreciating stuff, always new tools and new tech is exciting. I'm not going to spend much time on this because I did a talk at NCGIS 2 years ago on this very topic, and the video is still available. Things have certainly changed, but a lot of it is still the same. And I'll give a reference at the end too for a resource that'll let people explore these options. One thing that's new since 2019 is QGIS has a plugin specifically for redistricting. And this is a screenshot of that, and it's got some nice features. I actually incorporated when making this. This is another plugin, Data Plotly, which allows you to create custom graphs based on the data. There's some features like if you get the population deviation within the acceptable range, the line turns green. It's also got a nice tool that makes it very, very easy to select all the blocks in, for example, a municipality. So I think this may be a little outdated, but this was the corporate limits of Apex. And you can see it's for GIS folks, it's not tricky to do a selection query and select all the blocks that have the attribute of being in that town, but this tool makes it easy, like 2 clicks to select all of those. This is the Airtable that I put together, which is a summary of software packages. It also includes code repositories, specialized utilities, data sources, things like that. tinyurl.com/Blake's table. And I keep that updated. So that'll give you a way to explore a lot of the tools that are out there, particularly for power users. The other category that has seen a lot of change in terms of technology is the public mapping tools. So these are tools that are available in a browser for people to use to generate their own maps or to analyze maps that have been proposed. By contrast, this is not one of the public tools, but this is like the preeminent redistricting software used by a lot of consultants, and it's called Maptitude for Redistricting. And you can see it's a type of desktop GIS interface that we've been seeing for decades. And I think for a lot of the public out there who are used to working with things more like Google Maps, this kind of interface might be reminiscent of other interfaces from 20 years ago. I mean, remember texting with a number keypad as opposed to texting now with earbuds and dictating your text to a virtual assistant. I wouldn't say that the changes in the interface are quite as dramatic, but this, for example, this is Districtor, which is one of the free tools. And this is a much simplified interface with a familiar web map navigation, and also sort of a gamification aspect. You can see trying to get all these bars to line up to get the populations of the districts equal. Also specifically designed for a touchscreen interface. You can easily steer it with your finger. Azavia, a company from Philadelphia that's also presented at NCGIS in the past, has a similar tool. Another tool is called Dave's Redistricting app, and one of the modern things that they have is simultaneous editing. You can have multiple people editing a plan together, kind of like a Google Doc. And they recently announced that in 2020, they've had people draw more than 550,000 plans, redistricting plans. Keep in mind, this is 2020, so that's old data. These are not plans that'll be valid, that'll be viable once the new data comes out, but there are that many people that are interested and engaged and using these web tools. Which brings us nicely into public engagement. Number 9, public has really caught the redistricting bug. Tons of interest, like that example I just mentioned, but other folks who maybe aren't going to be inclined to draw maps are following it. There was a huge interest in reform movement in Michigan, for example, and famous people, celebrities, and politicians from both parties have been advocating for reform. Schwarzenegger here, Eric Holder. If you told me 10 years ago that redistricting and sexy, those words would be next to each other, I would have been very surprised, but there are a lot of people who are making efforts to get folks interested and involved. And in North Carolina in 2019, the court required that the drawing be done in a public manner. And so instead of being in sort of back rooms, as it's often been, there's more of an expectation now that this will be out in the open, not just for journalists like the NPR journalist who took this photo to be observing what's happening as the maps are being drawn, but in North Carolina, they actually live streamed not just a camera feed, but you could actually see as the maps were being drawn on the screen. And it sounds like the General Assembly is talking about doing something similar this time. And one of the elements, one of the criteria that will be weighed in, that will be considered this time, which I suspect will be given a lot more attention than 10 years ago, is this idea of communities of interest. Many good government groups are focused on communities of interest, or COIs. And these are harder to define. It could be cultural or economic. One example from North Carolina, maybe this time around, folks will want to have a congressional district where all the folks affected by the Gen X water pollution would be in the same district. So they have a representative who understands their concerns. And these COIs, or communities of interest, are often submitted by residents. This is an example of a talk that was given to, as you can see, discuss how COIs will factor into the redistricting process and how citizens can be involved in helping incorporate those COIs into election maps. So in terms of actual how geographic areas would be submitted, this is one tool. Districtor, which you saw before, which I talked about a little bit before, has a module, I guess it's a mode, where you can draw communities of interest and submit those in a way that can be digested by GIS staff. And Representable, which is shown here, is another such tool. That is our top 10. There are 5 runners up I very briefly touch on that didn't make the top 10. Demographic complexity. This is especially the dramatic increase in a lot of North Carolina counties and elsewhere around the country of Hispanic and Latino population. The census data quality, this related to COVID, is something that we could have talked about. Use of citizenship data, this seems to have faded somewhat, but it was talked about a lot in 2020. Reforms in other states, something that is significant, but not so much here. And then a future crystal ball one, there's some talk about whether Congress might restore the Voting Rights Act or sections of the Voting Rights Act, and also might impose requirements like prohibitions on gerrymandering or certain processes that would be required for drawing congressional districts. And with that, I will open it up to questions, and thank you for your attention. And also, just wanted to say I'll be at the social this evening at 5 o'clock, and I always love to talk to folks about redistricting. So.
Okay, Blake, this is Tim. We have several questions, and I might even add one myself unless we get more questions. So please submit any questions you have. Go ahead and do that. We've got a few minutes to do this. The first question is from Juan Garcia. If the redistricting data is released in September 2021, what is the time frame for local governments to challenge the 2020 decennial census using the count question resolution program?
I actually am not. The short answer, it's a great question. The short answer is I don't know. I'm not super familiar with that program. I will encourage folks to check out. There are 2 census experts presenting tomorrow at 11 a.m. and 12 noon, and I will be there for that. So ask the census gurus. Great question. Sorry, I can't help you.
Right, it's okay. The next question is from Toya King. Is there an ESRI solution?
There is, yes. Their solution is interesting. It's web-based. So some of the other sort of bigger companies that have commercial solutions those are desktop solutions, but ESRI's is a web-based solution. And if you Google ESRI redistricting solution, it'll come up, and it's for folks who've used ESRI's ArcGIS Online and things like that. The interface is very familiar, and it's mature. It was used. They had a solution in the last cycle as well. I know it was used in Utah, and they're trying to get it out and used by more people.
Okay. Next question. This is from Rich Elkins. Are you aware if North Carolina will be taking differential privacy issues into account for congressional redistricting and not have unnecessary VTD splits to obtain districts with a ±1 population precision when the data isn't that precise?
Great, excellent question. And I do not know whether they will. I certainly hope it'll be discussed. Tim, the moderator here, and I were discussing before we went live about how it's something that state officials are very much aware of. And my personal position on this is that practice of trying to get congressional district population equality to within 0.001% has always been sort of a silly exercise, and that it would make more sense to leave precincts intact, like you suggest. And I think this differential privacy and the understanding that block level population is certain to be inaccurate makes it all the more justifiable to move away from that. But the lawyers, ask a lawyer who is looking at precedent, and they may say, you know what, the safest thing to do is still to strive for that, even if it means splitting precincts. So excellent question. I'll be fascinated to see what unfolds.
Yep. The next question is from Julie Stamper. Is there any movement on using prison populations in their home districts and not in the community where the prison is located?
In other states, yes. In North Carolina, no. And that train has left the station. In other words, it's too late now to try and implement something like that. The states that have implemented it had to have the departments of corrections collecting the incarcerated people's information on April 1st of 2021. I'm sorry, of 2020 on Census Day. And just for folks who aren't aware, the idea is that a lot of folks would argue that it's more fair, instead of having people, especially people who can't vote, counted in the place where they're incarcerated, they should be counted in the place where they lived before they were incarcerated. And California is the biggest example of a state that is doing this. So there's some other sort of partial measures, like some people would recommend actually splitting up correctional facilities, so at least they're not all in one district. That's more feasible for something like a state house district, for example. Good question.
Okay, very good. We have one more question, and then I have one, if that's all right.
Please.
So the next question is from Hannah Williams. How would communities of interest be mapped and accepted?
That's still being figured out. So there are these web-based tools. I mentioned Districtor and Representable. You can find those at Districtor without an E, like Tumblr or Flickr. Districtor.org, also representable.org. And then some of the commercial vendors are also providing tools that they say will allow citizens to essentially draw districts and then export them. Some states may have like a portal set up so that these citizen-drawn communities of interest can be submitted. I think ideally they would be submitted with some type of explanation or justification, some narrative of why they're significant. Also, that would prevent people from just spamming government entities with thousands of communities of interest to confuse the situation.
Right. So the question I have is, do you see a trend, or do you see more of a direction for states to do commissions for redistricting rather than the legislators doing it?
Absolutely. I think that was number 14. I didn't put it in the top 10 list because there hasn't been significant reform in North Carolina. Not that there aren't people who have tried, but yes, including in states that ones that people might not have predicted it, but Michigan, Colorado, Utah, Missouri, Ohio, Virginia, all have implemented reforms. Most of those are commission-based. Michigan's, I think, is one that a lot of folks have pointed to as sort of a recent example, and that's one where it was done through a ballot initiative. Virginia is an example of one where they actually got a constitutional amendment without a ballot initiative. But yes, I think there certainly has been movement in that direction, and a lot of folks would argue that that's better than having elected officials drawing the districts from which they get elected.
Right. Very good. So earlier, Blake referenced the 2 sessions tomorrow. The 11 o'clock session is with Bob Coates. Bob is with the Office of State Budget and Management, but he's the governor's census liaison. He's going to be talking about the census and state estimates in North Carolina. And then at 12 o'clock, David Klein from the Census Bureau is going to be talking about the 2020 census. So look forward to hearing those. Thanks, Blake, for a very insightful presentation, and thank you those who contributed to the chat. Appreciate the time, and looks like we're heading up on a break, followed by some sessions and then the social. So enjoyed it, Blake.
Yes, likewise. Thanks so much, Tim.
Thank you.
See you around.